Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial. Go to audibletrial.com/Rushmore. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Greetings and welcome to the Mount Rushmore podcast. My name is Jeff, and I'm joined as always by my platonic friends, Richard.
Hello.
And Michael.
Howdy.
Richard and Michael debate very frequently about the top four, the Mount Rushmore of any given topic. And this episode, they are debating the Mount Rushmore of Canadians. Am I right?
Yeah, you're correct.
And who thunk this one? Was it you, Richard?
I was the one who thunked this out.
Why did you thunk it?
Because they need one, first off. They don't have one. I researched this. There's no Canadian Mount Rushmore.
Oh, there isn't?
No, I mean, the one we have is in South Dakota. Not quite North Dakota, but I think they can still see it because it's very flat.
Okay.
So I'm worried about them being a little jealous about it.
Okay.
Also, I have been to Canada like twice.
Oh, to get beer, strong beer?
Once was in high school. We went there for a jazz festival.
Oh, wow.
And I went to Vancouver and loved it so much I almost went to college there. Mm-hmm. And then after college graduation, I went there for a couple of weeks just to hang out and do Vancouver stuff.
And a lot of times in Mount Rushmore, we discuss things that are very apparent and understood by a lot of Americans and people all over. But I think there are a lot of people who the amazing citizenry of this wonderful country to our north is kind of a question mark.
Plus, there's a good chance that a majority of us will be moving up there
Any minute
now. Yeah.
Any minute now. Richard, this is a great topic, and due to the fact that we are, the three of us, very much xenophobic and ignorant, we could talk about what we believe our top Mount Rushmore of Canadians were or are, but there would be no governing authority to let us know our accuracy. Thankfully, we have a guest on our podcast, and this is a real-life Canadian and a real-life funny person. His name is Casey Corbin. He's a stand-up comic. And before he talks, I'm going to play a clip from some of his work that's available on Spotify.
I moved from Ottawa, all right, and I have found my apartment in the Toronto Star. And I've got an apartment there, and I moved down to Toronto. And when I got into my apartment, I called my friends, and I said, I just moved to Toronto, guys, let's party. And they're like, where are you? And I'm like, I'm at the corner of Kipling and Eglinton. And they're like, dude, you're in Etobicoke. And I was like, what the hell's that? And they're like, almost Mississauga.
And that clip was from Vampires Are Popular, some stand-up from the hilarious Casey Corbin. And Casey is on the Skype with us right now. How are you doing, Casey?
Oh, it's going fantastic. It's very nice up here in Canada today. And a great day for a podcast.
Yeah, I have that you are a comedian. You've appeared on Comedy Now, the CBC, Halifax Comedy Fest, Just for Laughs. And you're a Canadian Comedy Award nominee. Congrats.
Yeah. I'm a two-time nominee, so I've lost every time I'm consistent. That's one thing.
What's it like
about my career?
What's it like to have a working democracy?
Yeah.
Is it just beautiful? Is it just like...
Oh, well, our politics are just as crazy as everybody else's.
No, that's not true. That's I can guarantee you that's not accurate.
Right. Actually, you're absolutely right. It's not. But we it's just interesting the way it works up here because ours is a three-party system. So the majority of the country doesn't usually like the prime minister.
Oh.
Like usually it only takes the prime minister if an election could be called tomorrow. And it's not every 4 years. It's like whenever we feel like this, we need a change. And they'll call an election, and then the guy that's already in as prime minister usually wins because the other two parties split the vote. So 64% of Canada won't want the prime minister, but because he has 37%, he wins the vote.
Oh, wow.
I was trying to... this happened...
It's crazy.
This happened when I was up after college. I happened to be up there in Vancouver around the time of some city councilman election or something. And there were yard signs up for like vote liberal so-and-so for whatever it was city. And we're staying at a B&B, and I asked our host, so liberal, that must be like this. That's like the far left. Like, oh, no, liberal's not the far left at all. I'm like, what? Excuse me? And it took me
No, not at all.
yeah. So it was like, wait a second. So you've got liberal and then very liberal and conservative, but even conservative isn't really all that conservative compared to
like
us.
the liberals are in charge right now, I think, and they're going to legalize marijuana next year. So everything's in the process right now, like countrywide. So this is it's pretty exciting for marijuana.
Oh my God, yeah.
And
now there's twice as many
pretty
people.
exciting for every comic I know. So
well,
it's an interesting system.
Wanted to let then we're discussing politics. We're also discussing podcasts, and you have a podcast too. Tell us about your podcast.
Oh, it's called Talkin' Wrestling. It's on iTunes, and NSN Never Sleeps Network produce it out of Canada, out of Toronto. And basically, I have guests on, mostly Canadian comedians and people that are involved in wrestling, and any D to Z level comic that I can, add in between. So, so it's basically it's just a conversation about wrestling. It's not a review show. It's not a show that focuses on everything to date. It can be like wrestling from the past, or
that's awesome.
It's just it's just two people talking conversations of wrestling. Sometimes we do panel shows. Sometimes we have, like this week. If you follow wrestling, or if you did in the Attitude Era, we have the WWE's top wrestling impersonator, Jason Sensation, the forgotten member of DX. He is on the show this week, and he tells great stories of Owen Hart, Bret Hart, Vince Russo, Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Everybody that he's interacted with. It's just a real positive, fun show. We like to keep it that way. But sometimes we make the odd Chris Benoit joke that's inappropriate.
Sure.
Okay, got it. Well, hold on. Cross Chris Benoit off my list. Damn it.
Well, it sounds awesome. We're really glad you're on the show. And
I'm glad to be on.
All right, so let's get going with our show, the Mount Rushmore of Canadians. And Richard, since you chose the topic, Michael will start.
I have, thanks. I have 4 categories this week. Comedy, sports, and music. I kind of veered away from, even though we kind of started the top of this podcast talking politics, like the politics and the actual history of Canada, I know nothing about. There's a big white blank area in my knowledge, and I just was like, don't try to fake it. Just kind of go with what you know. So my first choice under comedy is Lorne Michaels.
All right.
Nice one.
Who is responsible for just about every comedian. It feels like he's had his hands in and around the necks of just about all of comedy in America for the past 40 years.
Yeah.
And even though he's not much of a comedian himself, if you ever see him on the show, he's very deadpan and very straightforward, and that's kind of like the character he plays. I think he plays himself, but he's very odd.
Yeah.
He is so instrumental in just the lives of so many other people that have had such a huge impact from other famous Canadians like Mike Myers and
even the Kids in the Hall.
And the Kids in the Hall as well. I mean, he produced that, and I saw a picture of like the 5 of them. I guess it was like the 30th or 40th anniversary of the Kids in the Hall last week. I think it was the 30th, and they all look so young and vibrant. And it was just amazing to see.
Not now, right?
No, they all look old. My apologies to all 5 of the kids. They all look terrible now.
Yeah.
But I think he was just like this amazing producer that is kind of taken granted for, but he's just had such a huge impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do feel like Lorne Michaels was responsible for the remaking comedy after the end of the vaudeville era. Essentially, the comedians... It almost seemed like there was a line in the sand drawn with Bob Hope and Milton Berle. And at that time, when Saturday Night Live started, those two were still famous, and those two were still the faces of television comedy. And Lorne Michaels ushered in this new wave of hippie, beatnik, druggy comedy that changed.
I mean, before
the face
that,
of television.
Variety comedy was like Sonny and Cher, or Carol Burnett, or kind of, for lack of a better term, hacky stuff like that.
So maybe the Smothers Brothers might have predated in terms of comedy that had a little bit of edge to it.
But even then, it's a guy with a yo-yo.
Yeah.
How edgy are the Smothers Brothers?
True that. Well, they were talking about Vietnam and
that's
things like that. So I'm interested from our guest, Casey. One thing I would say is a famous attribute for some musicians and comedians and entertainers in Canada is that they come to the United States and have some of their biggest success. Is that your perception?
Well, yeah, a lot of we're the only country that doesn't really have its own star system like we do, but it's just very poor, and most Canadians don't care about it because we're so immersed in America's culture. And so a lot of times it's looked at until you make it in America, you don't really make it in Canada. But once you go to the States and you make some success, it's a lot easier to come back and be accepted into Canada.
Yeah.
And Canadians love to point out whoever's Canadian. Like you'll be watching a movie with a Canadian and they'll be like, Jim Carrey's Canadian. And then you'll be like, yeah, we know.
We know.
And it's like, oh, well, did you know William Shatner's Canadian? They're like, yeah, most people know that. The fucked up individuals are Canadian. I'm sorry if I swore.
No, we're good. No, keep going.
Okay. But the messed up, individuals are usually, Canadian. So
yeah.
But that's totally the way it is. Like you make it in America, you're good to go and can't. Like you probably wonder where Jason Priestley's been since 90210. Well, he's been having sitcom after show up here in Canada that you don't see.
Has he really?
Wow.
Yeah, he's had an award-winning show up here where he plays a private investigator.
Are you yanking our chain? Because are you serious?
It's on HBO Canada.
Wait, there's an HBO Canada?
That is mind blowing. I did not realize that, and I'm so glad you're opening our eyes to.
Does he still have the sideburns? That's the most important question I think we all have.
I think he has a full-on beard. He has a beard now.
Well, Canada, I think by law, if you move back up to Canada, I think being in Canada, your beard just grows by 20% as soon as you cross the border.
I will ask you this:
it's with the exchange. It comes in with the exchange.
This is falling also in the category of the things that people do much better than in Americans, and I would say comedy is one of them. For the most part, my biggest comedic influences, like Michael said, are things that were initiated by Lorne Michaels and or the British broadcasting system, Monty Python, and it's the similar people from the Young Ones or the comic strip. So I think one thing that Americans don't really do well is observe their incredibly idiosyncratic behavior, and a lot of comedy that does observe that in a pointed way is imported from other places. So,
yeah, and I think Lorne Michaels did. Yeah, Lorne Michaels kind of opened up this, like you said, Michael, this kind of floodgate of Canadians. I mean, Dan Aykroyd of the original cast was Canadian. I think Gilda Radner might have been Canadian, right? And then
Gilda was not necessarily a Canadian. I think she was from Chicago, but she came. A lot of the Americans came up to Canada and worked at Second City in Toronto when they opened.
Right.
And so, like someone like Joe Flaherty, who people think is Canadian, is actually from the States, but he just spent his life living in Canada once he moved up here.
Just one of those fake Canadians.
Yeah, so he's become imposters. Canadian, but he's not actually Canadian. But when Lorne Michaels went down on Saturday Night Live, he brought down Danny. He brought in Jane Curtin. She's Canadian. Paul Schaefer, also Canadian. Right. So those are three of the mainstays on the original cast that were Canadian. Plus Gilda was Second City in Toronto at the time, and they brought her down as well. So there's technically, 4 people that were involved heavily with Canada that he brought down from Toronto that he also knew. So he knew all these guys.
I find it interesting that, he ran SNL or has run SNL very successfully, and then he chose to kind of go back into like the Canadian broadcast system with Kids in the Hall and have to operate under their rules. Because I know that like state-sponsored media, you have to have a certain number of actual Canadians that work on the shoot. Same thing with a certain amount of music
Canadian
that's played.
Content.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that he kind of took that challenge upon himself to go back and do a show under a lot stricter rules and regulations, but also, certainly a number of freedoms. They could cuss and really say what they wanted on.
You can be really edgy on Canadian. Yeah, you can be edgier on Canadian television than you can on American television. Like, there used to always be comparisons between our teenage high school show drama, which was called Degrassi, and the American equivalent, which was 90210. And I remember 90210, everybody was like, "Oh my God, Brenda had sex at the prom." And up in Canada, we're like, there's a girl on our show that got knocked up in grade 7 listening to Galway at a house party. We're just we're not afraid to put the edgy stuff out there.
I feel like your beard and your drama is a lot more potent than our.
And also their Drake. Speaking of
for sure,
yeah.
And a great fun thing to do if you watch Kids in the Hall is to watch the extras in a lot of the sketches and see how many times you can find Neb Campbell throughout the first couple seasons.
Oh, that's right. Actually, I knew this. Yeah,
she's an extra in a lot of the sketches.
Wow, that's fun.
That's great. One thing I'll say about Lorne Michaels, just maybe I don't know if we're wrapping up this yet, but his first big break was a short he did for the CBC called The Great Hockey Puck Shortage. And it's a spoof about like a winter when there was a shortage of hockey pucks and they didn't know what to do in Canada.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, check it out.
But that's bogus because everybody knows if you run out of hockey pucks, you use cow pies. Everybody knows that.
We do.
Frozen cow pies.
Okay, so my role is to kind of move things a little bit along when they need to. So Michael has come off strong with Lorne Michaels, and then Richard is up.
All right, so I did do politics as one of my 4, and I went with the father of Canada, John A. Macdonald.
Not Tony Canada.
Not John B. Macdonald. Not John C. Macdonald. No, please get it right, John A. Macdonald.
Yeah, but it's spelled E-H. Okay?
Yeah. So the thing about, for people who, non-Canadians, basically picture George Washington, but if a lot of people in America didn't remember who George Washington was, from what I understand, and also if George Washington was a massive alcoholic.
So was John A. Macdonald.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. John A. Macdonald was basically the father of the country and also the father of drinking in Canada in some ways. So some of the positives, he was the first prime minister. He is kind of credited with getting the different provinces and regions together into a confederation and getting the UK, London, the Queen, what have you, to agree to kind of allow a Canadian confederation. He built the Trans-Canadian Railroad.
By himself?
With his own 2 hands.
God, this guy is great.
He's Canadian. He's pretty strong. Canada strength. Bad news is when when they decided to build the Trans-Canadian Railroad, they had a lot of the First Nations people that live in there because, First Nations people. So he kind of just starved them out.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Our railroad is not our proudest moment in our history because we used Asian slaves to build it, and then we routed out the natives on the way through their land. So, but
whoops,
it's smooth to this day. It's a great way to travel now.
Whoops.
But as we've been discussing, John A. Macdonald may have been a bit of an alcoholic. For example, he once vomited on stage during an election debate. And his opponent said something like, "Was this the man you want running your country, drunk?" And allegedly he replied, "I get sick not because of drink, but because I'm forced to listen to the ranting of my honorable opponent."
Ah, cool burn.
Boom, roasted.
He often would miss debates and other political happenings because he was, quote, having one of his attacks, which I'm going to start using at work when I'm missing work. He once slapped an opponent during a campaign debate.
He's the original Rob Ford.
I was gonna preface him by saying, a Canadian politician who has trouble with substances, maybe slightly racist. Could have been Rob Ford. Is actually John Macdonald.
Michael, what's your second choice?
My second choice is under sports, and it's Mr. Gordie Howe, Mr. Hockey. He played 26 years in the NHL. That's a lot of.
And also played in the
fucking years.
WHL too, I believe. After
he played
that.
something, like another 5 or 6 years in another league.
Right.
From Floral, Saskatchewan. Now, where is Saskatchewan in terms of compared to Toronto, where you are in Ontario?
Like it's right above. I think the Dakotas.
Is there Is there a hated province?
It's usually most of the country doesn't really like Quebec.
Yeah.
Because they're the French-speaking province.
Yeah, we'll get to them later.
They have they have their own language, their own culture. They tried to separate, and they're kind of like most provinces are like when it comes to them.
Well, who's like?
But then there's a lot of people that hate Ontario.
Well, I was going to say because we have like Florida, and Florida is like basically if there's a story about somebody like having sex with an alligator and falling down a well or something stupid, something outrageously stupid. It's probably from Florida.
Yeah, it sprinkles some drugs in there too.
Is there like a province where you'd go, if there's some like weird like crime story, it's probably from?
Yeah, it's usually Quebec. Like Quebec is like when most people from Quebec retire, they go down to Florida. Honest to God.
Well, there we go.
Oh. They kind of connect up with each other.
Perfect.
Well, getting back to hockey now, that was my fault that we took us off on a little road trip to different provinces, but I was amazed looking at just his stats and like everything that went along with this gentleman. 23 out of his 26 seasons, he was an all-star. Just having the nickname of Mr. Hockey kind of puts you in like the closest we have in America is Mr. Baseball, and that was Tom Selleck in a movie. Like we have no one else that's kind of on that level of like the sport is basically your sport.
Ernie Banks wasn't Mr. Baseball?
We have a Mr. Coffee.
we have Mr. Coffee.
We have that.
And Mr. Peanut.
There we go, yeah.
Yeah.
We got two things. But it was just amazing to see just like the depth of his career. And you compare it to someone who I guess is equally as great in like Wayne Gretzky, who we just talked about a couple episodes back on
the trades one, yeah.
Mount Rushmore of Trades. And he kind of came in and Gretzky did things in such a whirlwind fashion, like broke all of his records within like it's seemingly half the time that he played in. And I don't know, do you have is there like a great debate in Canada on Gordie Howe versus Gretzky, or you throw Mario Lemieux?
No, it's not. The debate is never Gordie Howe versus Gretzky, because Gordie kind of always knew Gretzky was going to surpass him. Like Gordie Howe knew Wayne Gretzky when Gretzky was 9 years old. That's when he met him, and he watched him throughout his progression, and he knew that's the guy that's going to pass all my records. So here's the thing: the argument on who's the greatest hockey player of all time, it always boils down to the argument between Wayne Gretzky or Bobby Orr. And those are the two names.
Interesting.
And it is debatable. No,
I guess I guess Orr was a defenseman, so you're not just looking at the pure scoring stats.
No, exactly. And you're looking at the championships and the leadership and the greatness of the players. And then, there's always the argument against Orr that his career was cut short, where Gretzky's went so long. So it's always a great argument, So but Gordie Howe is Mr. Hockey. You can't argue that.
When we were talking about Gretzky and the trades, we talked about kind of like the betrayal of moving from like Edmonton to Los Angeles, and I wonder if Howe had any sense of that, since he played like nearly his entire career with Detroit. I wonder if that was just kind of built in, that he was always just south of the border. He was a Canadian, but he was always on an American team,
but just over the line.
Not even Detroit. Yeah, Detroit is just there's a tunnel to get to it. Like we're right beside it.
You just skate through the tunnel.
We just have to go through a tunnel. There's Detroit's right across the river, so there's a lot of Canadians that are going to Detroit games even back then. So, but it's just I don't think that has to do with it. I just think Gretzky came at a time when the game was being reinvented, and he became such a pop culture star. Like the guy, even when he was in Edmonton, a town that nobody cares about. Sorry, Edmonton. But
we're going to get letters from Edmonton now. We're going to get the one letter.
No, they can't write. Now, realize that I'm in Calgary, the rival town right now, so I'm playing to the Calgarians. But
there you go.
But here's the thing: the Wayne Gretzky was like doing The Young and the Restless when he was winning Stanley Cups in Edmonton. Like he was that famous. He was famous in the States. He was famous everywhere, and that trade to LA was a huge deal. So, but Gretzky is usually regarded better than Gordie Howe.
The thing I'll say about Gordie Howe is, I mean, Gretzky was, for all of his, incredible skill as an offensive player, Gordie Howe was a two-way player. I mean, he was somebody who, they came up with the name, the Gordie Howe hat trick, which is scoring a goal, getting an assist, and then getting into a fight. I mean, he played in an era where it was a lot more physical. I mean, he fractured his skull in a game, for God's sakes, and came back like a few months later. There was a toughness to a player like Gordie Howe that, Gretzky always had an enforcer, Marty McSorley or somebody like that, to fight his battles for him. I think there's something to be said, and maybe this is why he's Mr. Hockey, even if the debate isn't who is the best player of all time, that I think he has the qualities that Canadians might want to ascribe in terms of toughness and grit that maybe Gretzky didn't have.
Gretzky had a toughness. It's just that it was a different type of toughness. Like, there was a time where he took a puck in the head, went off the ice, came back on, and scored a couple more goals. Like against the Leafs one year when he was playing with the Kings, when the Kings went to the final.
Right.
But, it's just a different, but he would never fight, and that's just not the player he was. So, but Gordie Howe, definitely a great Canadian in his own right. No arguing that.
Cool. All right, Richard, what's your second choice?
All right, my second one, we'll stay with the sport of hockey. This is less a player and more a media personality.
I think I know where you're going.
We're going with Don Cherry.
Yeah.
Is he on your list? Was that the sports ? One that you had? Or?
No.
Okay, good. And Don Cherry, some Americans might know him because you can't get the Hockey Night in Canada broadcast, which, if you don't watch hockey, it's basically like Monday Night Football used to be in Canada. Like Monday Night Football or something used to be here. That's what it's like in Canada. It is the game of the week. If you're a hockey fan, that's what you watch. And he is one of the commentators. Michael, I believe, is showing a photo of Don Cherry to Jeff. He is known for his, let's just say, colorful outfits.
I don't know anything
eccentric.
I don't know anything about sports, but I have read about Don Cherry in my life before, and I read some weird things about his kid who tried to follow in his footsteps too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he did not have a success following in his father's footsteps.
I would try to describe him as a cross between like a John Madden or a Dick Vitale.
Yeah,
and then your racist uncle at Thanksgiving. That's kind of.
I think Don Madden. I would say he's the John Madden of hockey. He definitely. Except for the hockey player named John Madden. But I thought that played for the Devils. But
did Don Cherry play in his
He played
day?
one game. He played one game in the NHL. He had one game.
He's most famous for leading the Boston Bruins to many Stanley Cups and a couple Stanley Cups, and he was the coach of Bobby Orr and those great Boston Bruin teams. And I think he coached the Bruins for maybe 7 years. And and now he's just an old guy that says racist stuff in between periods in hockey games on television every weekend.
After he coached the Bruins, he coached the Colorado Rockies, which was Denver's team for a few seasons, and then they folded, and then they got the Avalanche back. But the slogan was, "Come to the fights and watch a hockey game break out." I think that pretty well summarizes what Don Cherry believes hockey should be. I thought it was bringing up kind of the grittier side of hockey. He was somebody who, for example, really didn't like the European players. And anytime he gets a chance in his broadcast to disparage, especially Russian players or Swedish players or Finnish players as being soft pansies, he'll go with that. Also, doesn't like players who wear visors on their helmets.
No.
Frequently, he believes that it's mostly the European players who wear the visors anyway because they're pansies.
What's wrong with visors?
Because I don't know. I guess he doesn't like, he wants someone to get hit in the eye occasionally. Okay. I don't know. Casey, help me out here.
He's an old school guy who's caught in his ways, and he's like, those Swedes don't go in the corner, and he's like, so he just, if you're not Canadian or American, he just doesn't like your style of hockey. He's very old and set in his ways. Like he's like when Canada did the list of their 100 people, he finished top 10 because so many Canadians love him. But he's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, time and time again he says the most politically incorrect things on television. But when he comes to talking hockey, that's what he's good at.
Last thing I'll say about Don Cherry, he was, surprisingly enough, he's a conservative.
Oh,
Shocking. He was one of the first people he made an appearance at Rob Ford's inauguration as mayor. And while he was there, he made a speech that denounced all the pinkos out there who ride bicycles and declared that Rob Ford would be the greatest mayor the city has ever seen.
this is the crack.
This is Rob Ford.
The Rob Ford. Okay.
Yeah. So a little bit off on that. He was certainly one of the biggest mayors the city has ever seen. I will. The one clip, if there's one clip you want to see of Don Cherry, in the 1987 World Junior Championships, which is like for players 20 in the early 20s, there was a huge brawl between Canada and the Soviet Union. And when I say huge, I mean both benches cleared. It went on for about 10 minutes. They actually turned the lights off in the stadium to try to get them to stop fighting, and they wouldn't stop fighting. And then they cut to Don Cherry, and Don Cherry just goes on this rant about, standing up to the Soviets, and he basically makes it like a Rocky scene or something like that. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's fantastic.
Wow. Hey, we're halfway through, and before we beg you to rate and review our podcasts, we want to suggest using Audible. Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you, yes, you, the opportunity to check out their service. Want more dirt on Lorne Michaels, stuff that even he doesn't know about? Check out Live from New York, the complete uncensored history of Saturday Night Live. With 180,000 other titles, Audible has it all. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Rushmore. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Rushmore for your free audiobook. Okay, Casey Corbin is our guest judge, and he's really lending a lot of gravitas and accuracy to much of our discussion about famous Canadians, the Mount Rushmore of Canadians. And so we're very appreciative. You can follow him at Casey Corbin on Twitter and at TNW Pod to follow his Talk in Wrestling podcast. And it sounds very entertaining from what he's described, where he actually sits down with comics, with wrestling aficionados, and discusses the great sport of grappling. So we are at our halftime, and we're going to ask you whether you live in the United States or whether you live in Canada or even Quebec to join us on iTunes, on Stitcher, on wherever you get podcasts, and download, rate, review the Mount Rushmore podcast. We'd like to know who also your favorite Canadians are. You can do that on the Mount Rushmore Presence, which exists on Facebook and Twitter. So we'd love for you to get in the dialogue and join us and let us know what you're all about.
I have some breaking news, guys.
What's that?
Don Cherry once appeared in a music video with the Trailer Park Boys for a Tragically Hip song.
Oh, wow.
That's the most Canadian thing ever. I think we've reached peak Canada right there.
Continue.
And that I believe the video is Music at Work.
Darkest one.
Oh, it's on the same album, though.
And Don Cherry's delivering fried chicken in the music video.
Okay, well, we're back from our halftime, and we are going into round 3, and Michael is up.
My next is under the category of sports, and it's Bret the Hitman Hart, famous wrestler and greased up, like the wettest hair in all of wrestling, right?
It's right up there with Triple H.
Yeah. The mid-'90s were a real low point for America to have enemies. We kind of had vanquished the Russians with the Cold War. Cold War's done. Desert Storm came and passed, and we kind of won that one. We mostly won, but kind of Saddam Hussein was still back in power. And there was a little bit of like anti-Middle Eastern kind of rhetoric that came in and around wrestling then. But we really didn't have any like major enemies. Like China was still on the come up. Like
North Korea was still just weird and out there.
Yeah, there were never any trouble. But when you got to turn to someone to be an enemy in wrestling, of course the next natural step is go up north.
Yeah.
And make the Canadians the evil bad guys. And it's not like Canada has always, like there's been a few, like, villainous Canadians in the past, the Mountie.
The Rougeaus.
The Quebecers.
Guys.
Yeah. But around 96, 97, Bret Hart, who is like, he has always been a hero. He's always been like a face within.
For a long time. When he first started out with the Hart Foundation,
That's true.
They were heels.
That's
but then
true. Him and Jim Neidhart were kind of The Hart finish was a little bit bad.
Yeah, but then he was like the classic face when he was a face. Like he was
yeah. He always made good with the kids.
There are no shades of gray.
Yeah,
Shades
he
of pink.
literally gave them shades of pink and shades of gray, as he would give his kind of faux foam sunglasses to like some smiling boy or girl in the audience. And around 96 and 97, they kind of, wrestling started to get, what's the word, more attitude-y. And like Stone Cold Steve Austin kind of was a villain, and they did but he was he was becoming very popular. He was kind of like this, he wasn't quite a hero yet, but he was like the anti-hero.
Yeah.
And they had a match where they did like a double turn where Bret Hart became a heel, and Steve Austin became the good guy, turned face, and it all kind of led up to a year later, Bret Hart leaving the WWF to join WCW, and the Montreal Screwjob. Which
wait, what? Is that when the girl lifts her leg?
That's the Quebec City.
Oh, sorry.
Close.
Basically, Bret Hart,
That's the Saskatoon Slammer.
He was probably the most popular wrestler.
Yeah, we're
Up
right
there.
close.
Up
in
there.
Canada, yeah. Oh, in Canada,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
He was on his way out. Like contract negotiations with Vince McMahon didn't quite go so well, and I'm sure there are a bunch of other factors. And he was still champion, and he was supposed to kind of drop the belt and before he left the company, but there's a lot of negotiations. He didn't want to do it in Montreal. He didn't want to do it in his home country's turf, and they kind of rigged it so that it was supposed to be like a double count out, and they're supposed to do another match afterwards, but Vince and Shawn Michaels and I can't remember who else.
Earl Hebner.
Earl Hebner. They kind of got together and...
The referee.
Yeah, and kind of rigged the match. They rigged a rigged match.
Which is hard to do. So they basically made it so Shawn Michaels put Bret Hart into Bret Hart's own submission move. And Bret Hart thought it was just part of the match, and then they'd continue on. But as soon as he got him in the submission move, the referee rang the bell, said that Bret Hart had tapped out, given up, rang the bell, gave Shawn Michaels the belt, and everyone got the hell out of Dodge.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this was somebody rigged the rigged match.
Yeah.
Okay.
Against the most popular wrestler in Canada.
And did it in Canada.
Okay.
Does he still have a loyal following?
Yes, he is still huge in Canada. He also is very high on the list, I believe he's in the top 50 of the top 50 greatest Canadians. He is, I cannot argue with Bret Hart. He is my favorite wrestler, and I think he is the best Canadian wrestler of all time. And I think 1997, it's just so great. Like, while he was a bad guy to you, he was never a bad guy to me.
That's right.
Everything that he said, I agreed with. I was like,
he was this unabashed, like,
pro-Canadian,
'cause
anti-American, almost anti-American.
Yeah, he spat upon
like,
kind of the righteousness of Americans and like how sloppy and lazy they've become. And,
yeah, and he made a lot of points like, our health care, is great. You leave people dying in the street, while in Canada everybody gets to go to the hospital for free. And of
course, and the American fans would boo. Boo! Going to the hospital for
boo!
free.
We don't want that.
Yeah, so it's amazing. So, when they were in Canada, Bret Hart was still a face, but they were in the U.S., Bret Hart was, but playing the same role.
Wow!
It was actually like even when they went to Europe, Bret Hart was still a face. When they went to India, he was still a face.
That's incredible.
But only in America was he the bad guy.
Yeah, that's incredible.
That's a very compelling choice.
We had another few years before we had a true superpower for Americans to be generally angry at. Mm-hmm. And of course it was Iraq again.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it was Bulgaria with Rusev. But
it was 10 years after that.
I was at the show I was supposed to go to the screw job. I didn't go because I went to a Buffalo Bills game instead.
Poor choice.
I didn't think that anything was going to happen because everybody knew that Bret Hart was going to be everything. Everything, like the whole idea was Bret Hart was going to give up the title in Ottawa the next night. And that's all I needed to see. I didn't need to see him beat Shawn Michaels in Montreal. But I had tickets to the next two Raws Monday, Tuesday. and I actually knew a guy that was being trained by Brett, so I was going to meet Brett. And then I get home after the Bills game, and it's late at night. There's all these messages on my phone, and it's like, you haven't seen the pay-per-view, and then all this and all that. And I had to watch it later on the replay, and it was just like, biggest regret of my life, not going to that Montreal card. And then the next night on Raw was just terrible. Not like everybody boycotted the show.
Yeah, but how'd the Bills do?
Oh, we lost 33-3 to the Patriots. So It was the beginning of the next 10 years to come. 15 maybe.
Okay, we're going like a bat out of hell. That's the bottom of the third. Richard, what do you got?
Okay, my next one, I am going comedy, and I'm going John Candy. From SCTV, which I think, to your point, Jeff, about being influenced, for me, SCTV was a huge influence.
Yeah.
And I think John Candy, I don't know that you could say there was a star of SCTV, but just me personally, anytime John Candy was on a skit or something, doing something on the show, there was just, you could tell something special could happen.
Yeah, he was the first breakout, I think, performer. I think he might have been the first person to leave the show, too.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah,
I think
right.
they brought Martin Short in to kind of replace
John Candy, yeah. And you just watch those episodes when he's in it, and even the characters that are supposed to be probably unlikable, like Johnny LaRue, the man on the town, megalomaniacal wannabe film director.
Yeah.
There's still something about John Candy that is able to make him likable, even though probably you're not supposed to like what the character's doing.
Yeah. I remember he was the guy with the snake on his face who sold satellite dishes. And you liked him if he was...
William B. Williams.
Yeah, William B. Williams or Dr. Tongue or... I loved his 3D House of Pancakes character, and Gil Shepard, the fish and musician, when he would take the musical guests.
I believe he took the tubes out one time.
Yeah. I love him and the Farm Film Report and
blowing things up.
Yeah, talking about things that blow up. So yeah, what was it about John Candy? Do you think that also continued when he got into American films? It's almost like he filled the void that was once occupied by John Belushi or these larger than life physically and comedically actors.
I mean, there's an element of that. I mean, his first kind of breakout roles was Stripes, and then I guess Splash. Yeah. And again, those are roles where I think a lesser comedian could have like taken it a different direction. Even with Splash, where his character is kind of a pervy ass.
Yeah.
He's still likable.
Yeah.
I'm amazed that you found the one comedian that somehow Lorne Michaels didn't get his mitts on.
Oh yeah.
Oh, fun story about this.
It's not that they didn't know him and they weren't friends. He did know who John Candy was.
Oh, sure.
So fun story about this. Apparently, John Candy hosted once. It was like 83. I don't even know if that might have been like non-Lorne Michaels years. But apparently...
Those were the...
Ebersol years. Apparently, John Candy was the most burned host on Saturday Night Live. So many times they would tell him, okay, well, we're probably going to need you to come in this week because we don't know if we're trying to line somebody up or something would happen. But so we'll be on standby. We're probably going to need you this week. And then they'd get someone else with a movie coming out that week or someone that they needed to get that week. And then they'd bump John Candy midweek. Right? Apparently this happened like a dozen times.
Wow. Is John Candy revered in the Canadian pantheon of comics or and performers in general?
He's at the top. He's at the very top. He's on stamps in Canada.
Wow.
He put a lot of money into the Canadian Football League.
Did you know they have their own football league, guys?
He bought the Toronto Argonauts with Wayne Gretzky and Bruce McNall, the owner of the LA Kings at the time. And they helped finance the league. Yeah,
I mean, they won a Grey Cup with him, and
they won a Grey Cup with John Candy won a Grey Cup in his hometown.
Yeah,
with the team. So and he was so beloved and so liked and just such a great man. Like not a blemish on his career. You never heard of any controversy that he caused. He just spent his life making people happy, and he was very good at it.
Two things about John Candy. One is I think his success kind of opened the doors for a lot of comedians who weren't necessarily, let's say, the Chevy Chase leading man type of comedian. Yeah. Like you could be Chris Farley or maybe even someone like an Adam Sandler. I'm not comparing their comedy styles, but maybe somebody whose comedic presence wasn't necessarily, it has to be a comedy and there's a romantic love interest and there's all this going on. And the other thing about John Candy is I recently found this out that after he'd done Splash and he had done Stripes and he'd really started to get his movie career going, he did a movie called Armed and Dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
I think we might even reference this on the show at one point, this movie, with Eugene Levy. And it's, I don't know, I haven't seen it in 30 years. I don't know if it's any good or not. I suspect it's kind of your typical mid-'80s sort of buddy comedy thing. But the reason he took the movie was because he knew Eugene Levy's career wasn't going great after SCTV stopped. So he decided to take this movie knowing that it would get made and knowing that it would have some success because he was John Candy at the time.
What a pal.
Yeah, he basically took it just to give Eugene Levy more of a, I guess, exposure in the United States to help his career.
He is, like, when he was involved in the CFL, I'm friends with the old general manager of the Ottawa franchise, and they were going bankrupt at the time. And basically, she was trying to tell the coach to keep the players in practice so they wouldn't go cash their checks because their checks would bounce. And they had to bring in John, and John was actually coming in to make sure that every player got paid. If the checks bounced, John was going to pay them out of his pocket.
Wow.
That's unbelievable.
This is a story that nobody knows because I've heard it right from the general manager herself. But then when they found out that the checks, it was okay and everything, all the checks would clear, all the players were wondering what John Candy was doing there. And the GM, she was 29 years old and the first female GM in professional sports history. John Candy grabbed her and he said, Joanne and I are getting married. And he dipped her over and gave her a big kiss and the team celebrated. No. And he was just joking. But it was just like, but he came in to save a football team that wasn't even his.
A league.
Because he cared for the Canadian Football League. He cared for the league itself because Canadians love the Canadian Football League.
That's incredible.
So we're going to the fourth round, and we're very privileged to have Casey Corbin. He's at Casey Corbin on Twitter, and he is a dyed-in-the-wool, real live Canadian, and he's giving a lot of color and backstory to a lot of the things that we kind of know a little bit about, but he's letting us know the cultural point of view on some of these things, and he's giving us a lot of insight. So we're appreciative that he's here and is very knowledgeable about wrestling.
It's part
sports.
of NAFTA, actually.
It's part of NAFTA. This is part of a NAFTA.
Yeah, it's part of a NAFTA exchange. We're going to send Michael over to Canada in a couple of months to talk about pizza.
Then Casey's going to come back down here and stay on your couch, Jeff.
We'll take him. I'll take him. Happy to have him. Okay, so this is the final countdown, the fourth and final round. Michael, go for it.
My final category is music, and my pick is Celine Dion.
Oh, dear.
And when I was looking at different Canadian musicians...
My last pick's a musician, too.
So. Okay. When I was looking at Canadian musicians, I was amazed to find how many are Canadian that I thought were American. Like Neil Young.
Who, by the way, is my last pick.
Is he?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's great. But it was one of those that, I was like, I 100% thought he was American.
Yeah.
But Celine Dion is 100% Canadian. In my mind, in everyone's mind. She's
Quebecois.
She's as, Quebecois as humanly possible.
She's as Quebecois as poutine.
Yes.
From, the pomp of her singing performance and the grandioseness, but also, that kind of smear of just Frenchness that kind of just runs all over her.
Yeah.
But, she's so popular for, basically two huge songs in the late 90s with My Heart Will Go On from Titanic and then, what was the other one? It's All Coming Back to Me Now, where she just, kind of became, and maybe she was always a huge star in Canada, but maybe it just needed these two huge songs to really push what, how powerful a singer and how big a singer she is. I don't have any sense of what she's like in Canada's terms, but in America, I think she's the most famous Canadian singer to me.
Most famous for being Canadian. Really not Geddy Lee.
No, it's funny. They're people that if you told me they're Canadian, I'd be like, oh, okay. But it doesn't be oh.
You remember Bryan Adams as Canadian.
Yes.
There's some part of you that remembers that.
Yeah, but it's not it's not if I think about her bio, my bio is Celine Dion, Canadian singer who she's not a singer first. She's a Canadian singer first.
Interesting.
I would be curious, do people discuss Celine Dion in Canada? Casey, is there a perception of who she is or what she's like?
Oh, of course. She's like, when she got married, her marriage was on television. Like, it was on Canadian television. Like, it was broadcast, her wedding.
Well, like it was Princess Di or something?
Yeah. Wayne Gretzky's
Wow.
wedding was the same. Wayne Gretzky's wedding was broadcast across Canada, and so was Celine Dion's.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Is that a respectable thing to do? Because I think here's some celebrities, even though they pimp out every aspect of their marriage in tabloids and on social media, the wedding itself, they have even banned the airspace above it so helicopters don't fly over and try to tape their wedding.
Yeah.
But they sold the rights.
Yeah, she's enormously huge. She's financed a lot. She has a lot of money into different restaurants in Quebec, including a place called Schwartz's in Montreal, which is a gold mine, which I've eaten there every time I go to Montreal. Here's something. She's Oprah Winfrey's #1 guest of all time.
Huh.
Number 2 is Chris Rock. But the most appearances on Oprah is Celine Dion. So if you wonder why she's so famous in America, that has something to do with it.
You mentioned at the very top of the show how like one of the integral things about making it in Canada is making it in America. And Celine Dion certainly she had a show in Las Vegas that's made more money than anything else in Vegas.
I know. It's
$385 million according to like Wikipedia. That she's made from that one show that she ran for a few years.
She was Blue Man Group.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, she made it huge in Vegas.
Yeah, basically she has been.
She was like the first one to do like a big residency.
That Coliseum
there, correct?
residency.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
they wouldn't. Yeah, you're totally true.
So I'm sure Titanic made her. Got her foot in the door in America, and then she definitely kicked it open and has become something that is just worldwide at this point.
Casey, question is: at one point we were discussing, is there a sense of a So let me try to phrase this. I think at the beginning of the podcast you made it sound like Canada is very happy to look towards your neighbors to the south for their celebrities. Is there any sense of a resentment towards those celebrities who go off and find success in Canada? Or is it kind of known that that's where an entertainer or an athlete or somebody might have to go ply their trade, and that it's really a foregone conclusion that if they want to pursue fame, they're going to go to the U.S.?
I think it's a bit of both. I do think, I don't think people get upset when people go to the States. I think they're excited for them to go to the States because, the American dream is alive and well. And, it's not just within America. The American dream is for everybody in the world that looks at America and wants to go there and wants to make it there. That's the land of opportunity. That's how you've marketed yourself around the world. And so if for us in Canada, I want, it's my goal to get to LA and move there eventually. Once I get all my papers and everything in order, and, it's just a matter of paying a lot of money to get down there and do it right. So it's because you could want to be the person that wants to make it in Canada, but in Canada, there's a glass ceiling or where you can get so far and you can see the people that are in there, the other room, but nobody wants to let you through because they're insecure about their spot in show business.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any Americans that have come up to Canada to make it?
During the draft, when there was a draft in the States, the band Heart was originally a Canadian band because they were all draft dodgers and they were in Vancouver. And then they became a Seattle band. But the first 2 albums of Heart are considered Canadian, and they get more airplay on Canadian radio.
As part of the Beaver Hour, I believe it's called.
Okay, so we're in the bottom of the 4th. It's time for Richard to drive us home. Reel us in.
All right, so I mentioned that Neil Young was my last choice.
Yeah.
It's interesting you brought up the draft evasion thing because one of his early bands in Toronto was called the Minor Birds and was actually fronted by Rick James.
Oh, wow.
Who's from Buffalo.
Right, who's from Buffalo and who had come up to Canada after he got drafted. And he was in a band with Neil Young for about 6 weeks.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
You can pretty much imagine how that one went. Neil Young, a proud Canadian, still a Canadian citizen, even though he's been living in California for 20, 30 years now, probably. I think he still isn't even an American citizen yet. I think he's just a Canadian citizen.
He doesn't need to be.
Yeah, Neil Young can be
You get no benefits nowadays with it.
pretty much.
I'm a resident of marijuana.
Neil Young, who is certainly on the Rushmore of musicians who look like scarecrows.
Yeah.
He's Neil Young. I love Neil Young, one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Also a singer.
Close to.
But certainly as a songwriter, it's hard to think of an artist who has not just made an incredibly diverse catalog of music, but has also done it so well for such a long period of time. And I remember that Neil Young was Canadian while we were going through this. And I started to think about sort of him as a Canadian and then coming to the United States and how that probably influenced the type of music he made.
Oh.
I mean, I would have to imagine as he's writing Ohio, in 68, that he's looking at that from a different perspective as a Canadian who's coming down here and seeing these riots and shootings in colleges and stuff like that, even than someone who is an American would see that.
Yeah. You know what I think he also did very well, and probably as somebody who, I think of somebody like Bruce Springsteen who became anti-corporate rock. I don't feel like Neil Young ever stopped being anti-establishment, anti-government, anti-big business, and its meddling in art and stuff like that. I feel like Neil Young had a 4-decade track record to doing that, and I feel like other artists really kind of spoke out once it became fashionable.
You're right, and he spoke out about it in the mid '80s with "This Note's for You," and made fun of every artist that did a commercial for anything that sold out. But on the same token, when he wrote this song, he mentions every single brand that advertises this song. And the first lyrics like "Ain't doing it for Coke, ain't doing it for Pepsi, ain't doing it for Coke."
I recall back it was probably like 94, 95 when Pearl Jam was really blowing up. They made like a huge abrupt about face in terms of music videos, in terms of promotion, in terms of anti-consumerism, like right when they hooked up with Neil Young.
Right.
Like they put out Mirrorball together as like a dual album as Pearl Jam and Neil Young. And then like right away it was like, oh, Pearl Jam's no longer selling concerts, doing concerts through Ticketmaster. And they kind of adopted his, like you guys said, like this anti-establishment thing, kind of took his kind of more personal path. It's interesting to see just how much he's affected things, even that far into his career.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it was like 80 or 81, he directed a movie that was basically about this anti-nuclear movie and featured Devo. And, for someone who had been, a musician in the 60s to now in the 80s be, doing stuff with Devo. Or like you said, then you go to the 90s and he's doing stuff with Pearl Jam. I mean, just his ability to remain relevant.
Yeah.
For going on 4 decades now is something that's really just remarkable.
Yeah, like we have a lot of bands up here in Canada that don't make it in the States because there's somebody else already filling that void. Like your Melissa Etheridge is our Sass Jordan, who was a judge on Canadian Idol, and she had this long career of sounding like a female Rod Stewart, but she never made it in the States because Melissa Etheridge came out around the same time. So, we have things like that where we have Canadian versions. Like the Tragically Hip never really made it in the States because, the States already had REM, which was a very similar band.
Right. Unfortunately, Casey, your Nickelback is also our Nickelback. That's a problem.
Well, that's the thing is we keep on giving Nickelback, and it just goes back and forth, and neither of us want it.
But can't the exchange rate just take care of this and reduce it to zero at some point?
This is what happened with NAFTA. Yeah. Again, guys.
I feel like Neil Young was the dark to the light of Joni Mitchell. Canadians who came to the U.S. and then had songs that were kind of analytical of U.S. culture, U.S. entertainment industry, and even if we had For Dead in Ohio, she had the Back to the Garden or the Woodstock song. I forget what. Yeah. These gentlemen have debated the top 4 Canadians, and you've been tremendously helpful at giving us actual insight as based on the rough Wikipediaing that they have done. Really no good research. So we're going to do 2 things. First, we're going to listen to who you might choose as amongst your top 4, 1 or 2 or 4 if you choose. And then you and I are going to evaluate together to whom of these morons should be given points. So I'd love to hear you chime in on what comes to your mind when you think of top Canadians.
Okay, so my list, I broke it down into 4 different categories: entertainment, sports and athletics, politicians, and then just overall effect in society, in the world, like overall worldwide effect. It was the other criteria for the other spot. So the first person I agree with in the entertainment, I just, I love this guy's music. We've just spent the last 3, 4, 5 minutes talking about him. I love, in order to be a great artist and a great musician, and I think there's a sense of, if you're a celebrity and you make it and you have longevity, you have to give back. And Neil Young has always been anti-establishment. He's always been against the man. He's always been for the environment. He's been very charitable throughout his career. He's always given back. He even went back to Crosby, Stills, and Nash a couple times. Neil Young, I believe, is one of the greatest Canadians, and he's on my list. So I have him.
Unfortunately, by the way, a Southern man don't want Neil Young around anyhow, so we might have to disqualify.
Who else do you
know? Okay, so I have Neil Young. Next, I have worldwide effect, Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. I think that is fairly self-explanatory. We, the whole world used telephones for so long, still do to this day, and I can't imagine the world without a telephone. So Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. Also, and he's not even the most famous person from Brantford, Ontario, because Wayne Gretzky bumps him in popularity.
Oh, wow.
Most people will phone each other to talk about how great Wayne Gretzky is and not realize that Alexander Graham Bell's from down the goddamn street. Brantford, Ontario, this small town, has put out Wayne Gretzky, Alexander Graham Bell, and Phil Hartman. That's a good load for a town.
That's pretty great.
So anyways, Alexander Graham Bell is on my list. The other 2, neither of you, nobody's mentioned. Terry Fox is the greatest athlete Canada has ever produced. A lot of people don't know him. There's an ESPN 30 for 30 on him, done by Steve Nash, one of our greatest basketball player ever, actually. I could have went with James Naismith, who invented basketball, but I didn't. I went with Terry Fox, a marathon runner who got cancer at a young age. I believe was 18, 19 years old. He lost his leg to cancer, and at 20, 21 years old, he decided he was going to start the Marathon of Hope and run across cancer with one leg and a broomstick on the other, and try to make it across Canada
Casey,
to raise money for cancer.
Sorry, just because cancer is such a hot topic, I think you had a little bit of a hiccup in what you just said. You said he was going to run across cancer.
No, he's going to. Well, he is going to run across cancer.
That's true.
But he's going to run across Canada, and he's doing it to fight cancer. So he took cancer to a national awareness in the 80s, 81, and he's a national hero to this day.
I was seriously thinking about putting Terry Fox on there, and Terry Fox.
This is called pandering.
Yes. Ignore this.
No, because
we know your game.
Yeah, you know my game.
There was a guy that actually, after Terry Fox passed away, he didn't actually make it. He only made it halfway across Canada. He stopped in Thunder Bay and realized, fuck, if the rest of the country's like this, I'm not going anywhere. And he passed away. But there was another guy with one leg, and there was also a marathon runner that had cancer, and he was like, oh, well, I'll just go finish the race. And he did, but the country doesn't really respect this guy.
Oh, boy.
Oh.
The last person on the list is Tommy Douglas. Tommy Douglas, it overall in Canada was voted as Canada as the number one greatest Canadian of all time. There are three things that he's notable for that I'll mention off the top. He discovered the new Democratic Party, so he created the third party, major party in Canada, and was the leader of that party for many years. He also is the man that's responsible for creating our health care. And I know what a lot of people are thinking, like, why would he be number one and Terry Fox number two? Like, why is it seems to me that somebody that runs across Canada with one leg is better than a guy that invented a political party. But, let's be honest, Terry Fox wouldn't have that other artificial leg to run on if it wasn't for the free hospital that was created. So there'd be no marathon of hope. It'd just be a marathon of hop. And the first hop out of Newfoundland is really far because it's an island. So that's what you need to know. That's why Tommy Douglas is better. And then just a side fact, the fact that he created our healthcare system, free hospital, the fact that he created this new Democratic Party, which is very important in Canada. The third thing he did was his daughter married Donald Sutherland, and he's Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather.
Oh, mic drop. Oh, my God. That's enough.
This is why we only have a guest on here every once in a while, is because they just school us so badly that our fragile egos just can't take. I can't take someone that's an expert in some other garbage topic that we thought of drunkenly.
Snowflakey Americans just.
Well, I think we can all agree, and I'm sure your listeners will agree, that you bitches just got owned so hard by guest Casey Corbin.
Yeah, not good. Not good.
Casey, thank you again for listing your picks, because another reason you're owning today's discussion is because you listed something that's kind of outside of the categories, and that was an inventor and a politician, social welfare pioneer. So you've expanded our views even into new categories. So now it gets down to the judging portion, and although listeners and we would probably agree that you won, I would like to see which of these schmucks lost. And one thing that I observed while I was taking kind of with a little bit that I was paying attention, I was keeping track. Each of these guys chose a hockey figure in Don Cherry and Gordie Howe. Each of these guys chose a musician in the form of Neil Young and Celine Dion. Each of these guys chose a comedy figure in the form of John Candy and Lorne Michaels. So if I were to judge, I would say it comes down to who would win in a fight, John McDonald or Bret the Hitman Hart?
That's a tough one.
That's a tough one.
How much alcohol has Johnny McDonald had?
But I'm interested in knowing your calls on even these couplets here. If you had to make a call, or how you would like to judge it, Casey, because honestly, that's my first way of looking at it. But
I'm gonna say, in the first round, if we went by rounds, although Sir A. McDonald is great, John A. McDonald is great. As far as I go, I'm a stand-up comedian. Lorne Michaels, far more effect on my life, and I was considering him, but I went with the inventor of the telephone. But Lorne Michaels is, like Chris Rock once said, Saturday Night Live is the X-Men of comedy, like the X-Men school of comedy. That makes Lorne Michaels Xavier. So, Lorne Michaels, I think, is a better choice than John A. McDonald.
All right.
I think Gordie Howe or Don Cherry, although most of Canada might disagree. I just think, Don Cherry is a coach. Gordie Howe is one of the greatest hockey players ever. And I think Gordie Howe is a great choice there. So I went with Gordie Howe on that one. Obviously, I picked Neil Young, so we know that. So I went with Neil Young in that one. And then, oh my God, like Bret Hart versus John Candy. It's like you guys set me up to rip my heart out, because these are two of my heroes. Like if you went to my heroes Mount Rushmore, Bret Hart and John Candy would both be on. But I have both autographs up in my wall in my room. I've been lucky enough to meet both John Candy in '91 at a football game in Ottawa, and Bret Hart I've met a couple times. But out of the two of those, Bret Hart had a longer impact, and wrestling is far more international the way than John Candy is. But John Candy, there wasn't a popular fat comic as a leading male since Jackie Gleason on television. You know, and I'm a fat comic, so I really have trouble debating who's better between John Candy and Bret Hart. But I think in the end, your heart is more important than candy, and that's a terrible joke. But I don't know, that one I can't even decide. I guess I'm in Calgary right now, and it's Bret Hart's home, so I'm gonna say Bret Hart.
All right.
I have a wrestling podcast.
That's true. Yeah, that is true.
If anything, this should just be like a springboard for your own stuff. So
he does not have an SCTV podcast. So
well, those
no, I don't.
You heard it from an actual Canadian. It's Casey Corbin at Casey Corbin on Twitter and at TNW Pod for his Talkin' Wrestling podcast. It looks like Michael Winfield got 3 points to Richard Manfredi's 1 point for Neil Young.
Much like Canadian football, I was able to get 1 point somehow. So.
That is great. Yes,
scored a roog.
Yeah. So, Casey, you've been kind enough to spend about an hour with us chatting. We really appreciate it. We invite all listeners to check out Casey's work. You can Google Casey Corbin, Corbin, and find him all over the internet. He's got a YouTube channel. He's got a comedy album on Spotify, and you can also follow at Casey Corbin on Twitter to find updates and find out where he is currently touring, because he's all over the map as a touring comic as well. So just want to say thank you so much for repping your country so well and schooling us so hard, and thanks so much for being on the show. So this has been the Mount Rushmore podcast. As always, I'm Jeff.
I'm Richard.
I'm Michael.
And see you later, Casey.
Thank you, buddy.
Hey, thanks a lot, guys.